right, so we're going to get started. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to talk about the sports revolution, how Texas changed the culture of American athletics with author Frank Guridy. Please post your questions about our discussion in the chat box and we'll get back to them at the end of the program. Our author is an award-winning historian and professor of history and African American studies at Columbia University. He authored the award-winning Forging Diaspora, Afro-Cubans and African Americans in a World of Empire and Jim Crow, and edited a collection of essays entitled Beyond Del Barrio, Everyday Life in Latina America. In addition to his many scholarly publications, his writing and commentary on sport, society, and politics have appeared in Public Books, Columbia News, NBCNews.com, and The Washington Post. He is also the co-host of the new Say It Isn't Courageous podcast on baseball, politics, and social justice. So welcome. Thanks for being with us. And do you want to get started by talking about the book and maybe reading a passage?
I would love to do that. Thank you, Jennifer, and the Fort Worth Public Library for organizing this event. I'm very excited to be a part of it. I wish I was there in person. One of the delights of Texas is springtime, March weather. As when I lived in Austin, I got to know that very well. But I will settle for this encounter on Zoom. I'm very grateful to be here. So as you said, Jennifer, I'm a professional historian, who writes and teaches topics in the history of the United States. And these days, my specialization has become the history of sport and the histories of social movements, right? And to me, I studied the past, not to tell us what we already know. I think sometimes people think historians are there to just tell people the facts, tell us a story that we already know. But what makes history dynamic and exciting is our ability to tell stories that have not been told, to uncover aspects of the past that has not been told at all or adequately enough. Our job as historians, as I see it, is to denaturalize the present, to kind of think about the ways in which, not just how history led us up to this point, through sort of, kind of impersonal historical forces, but they are really a product of moments, historical moments that led us down a certain path and not down other paths, right? And I think looking at history this way, allows us to look at key moments in the past that really do inform, the outcomes that we wind up having in our society. And to me, the 1960s and 70s is one such moment in the history of sport, in the history of social movements, in the history of the United States as a whole. My earlier work, as you said, Jennifer, was on Cuban history. I worked on a book that looked at Cuban-U.S. relations. And after I finished that book 12 years ago, I decided to shift my focus to a longstanding passion of mine, sports. I am a sports fan, and I did play sports growing up, baseball in particular. I was not good at other sports. But to me, sport is an intellectual exercise. The aspects of the strategy, the thinking about, how plays come together, how execution happens, really had a profound impact on me, as well as is thinking about sport as a unique lens that really allows us to see our society in a different way, right? To see what we value, what our aspirations are, and how sport has catalyzed social change. And I think the story of sport in Texas and in other parts of this country, but Texas in particular, shows how sport did catalyze dramatic social change in the era of the civil rights movement and the second wave feminist movement. I like to exemplify some of these preoccupations and insights by reading a passage from the third chapter of my book. It looks at the racial integration of big-time college football in Texas during the 1960s and 70s, centering on the University of Houston and Southern Methodist University, SMU, really the old Southwest Conference, which was essentially a precursor to what's today's Big 12. And I'm going to read the opening passage, and then we can just move from there. This is chapter 3. Here I go. It was a partly cloudy Saturday afternoon on November 5th, 1966, when the Southern Methodist University Mustangs faced off against the Texas A&M Aggies in a regular season college football contest at the Cotton Bowl Stadium in Dallas. The two teams belonged to the Southwest Conference, which remained one of the preeminent college football conferences in the country. The Mustangs, nicknamed the Ponies by their fans and the local press, had languished in mediocrity for years. but led by their sophomore sensation, Jerry Levias, the first African American scholarship football athlete in the previously all white conference. They had won 6 of their first 7 games with a few dramatic come from behind victories. Their opponents that day, the Aggies of Texas A&M, were in the midst of a disappointing season with only 3 wins, 4 losses, and 1 tie. The previous year, when it was announced that Levias had signed with SMU, Gene Stallings, the A&M's head coach, had questioned the wisdom of white schools signing black student athletes. He said, quote, "A team that will work, pull, and fight together and really get a feeling of oneness. I don't believe we could accomplish this with a Negro on the squad," unquote. With their surprising season that fall, the Mustangs seemed to be proving otherwise. A large crowd of 55,000 fans came to the Cotton Bowl to see if the Mustangs could continue to do so. The game turned out to be a hard-fought contest. Here's do a little football play-by-play for you. The Aggies raced to a 14-0 lead, but the Mustangs came back to tie the score in the third quarter. With 11 minutes left in the final period, the Mustang defense forced Texas A&M to punt. Back to receive the punt was Jerry Levias, the electrifying kick returner who caught the ball at the 17-yard line. Punt returning, football fans know, can be a harrowing experience because players who take on the challenge have very little time to avoid onrushing tacklers who fly down the field at top speed. But the speedy and elusive sophomore from Beaumont, quote, "wiggled and jiggled," as Dallas Morning News sports editor Walter Robertson described, to find a little running room as Aggies converged on him from all directions. As he encountered more trouble at the 25-yard line, he suddenly paused to let the momentum of the Aggie defenders carry them away from him as they desperately lunged to bring him down. But they could not. Levias's agility won him space to operate. Now the teamwork between black and white teammates that Gene Stallings could not envision was happening before his very eyes, as 2 of Levias's white teammates, Pat Gibson and Mike Mitchell, helped clear defenders from the kick returner's path. After running toward the middle of the field, Levias suddenly cut back to the left sideline, where still more menacing Aggies tacklers had awaited. But one more crunching block from another white teammate, George Wilmot, a 230-pound senior defensive end, cleared the last tacklers from Levias's path. His speed did the rest as he zipped past Aggie would-be tacklers as though they were standing still. The speedy Mustang broke into the clear, racing past the SMU bench as his teammates and coaches exulted in triumph. The Aggies realized what previous opponents that season had discovered, that no one in the conference possessed the speed to chase down the sensational sophomore from Beaumont. Touchdown, Mustangs! Levias's game-winning 83-yard punt return touchdown eventually gave the Ponies a 21-14 victory. A Jack Beers photograph, which was published in the Dallas Morning News the next day, captures Levias in mid-gallop, the soon-to-be all-Southwest Conference player racing toward the end zone with A&M Aggies gassed in the background as his Mustang teammates smiled with joy. The photo is reminiscent of other racial scenarios in the sordid history of the U.S. South. Runaway slaves fleeing slave catchers or innocent black men running from racist law enforcement officers. But in this context, Levias wasn't simply running for a touchdown in a college football game. Here in the stadium named after cotton, the commodity that symbolized the brutal exploitation of the enslaved, one of their descendants was running from the shadows of racial slavery and Jim Crow segregation and ushering in a new moment in the region's and the country's history, a post-Jim Crow athletic order. That's the way I open that chapter as I try to sort of highlight the social significance of athletic performance. And this is one of the things that I do throughout the book.
I think one of the things that we hear a lot right now is about how sports should be just about the game, but it's never really been just about the game. And one of the things I really liked about this is how, you've taken a lot of care to show how civil rights, feminism, and economics all drive sports. And can you talk about why we can't unravel sports from political conversations?
Yeah. And I think one of the legacies of this era, meaning, and I would go back not just to I wouldn't just go to the 60s and 70s, but in particular when Jackie Robinson becomes the first black player to be signed by a Major League Baseball franchise in the 20th century in 1945, 46. He winds up playing for the Dodgers in the late 40s and mid and early 50s. Is the notion that sport helped resolve our country's social problems, our racial problems, and then our gender hierarchies, right? But if you pay close attention, we know that's not true. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 years, I would say, even though there's precedent for this beforehand, but in particular over the last year with the pandemic and obviously with the explosion of the protests inspired by the movement for Black Lives after George Floyd was murdered, is a real amplification of the gross inequities that we see in our society in general, but in sports in particular, right? I think you see this very clearly when you look at the dynamics that led many universities to essentially encourage or coerce their players to play football and other sports during the pandemic when it was at its most deadly last year and even moving into this year. We saw this just this week. If those of you who were fans of the college basketball tournament, March Madness, the gross inequities between men's sports and women's sports at the college level, right? So the inequities in the sports world parallel the inequities outside the sports world. And because so many athletes in the most revenue generating sports tend to come from marginalized backgrounds, the question of equity and justice will always remain, right? And I think we focus sometimes too much on the salaries of these super, super talented athletes. And we say, well, look at how much money a LeBron James figure or, your favorite Dallas Cowboy player is making. And we think, well, that shows you that this is an equitable structure. But really, the vast majority of athletes, just like the vast majority of Americans, don't enjoy those opportunities, right? And so I think you've got that pre-existing inequitable structure coupled with, the polarization of politics in our country now, and I think that, so in some ways, it is disappointing that we're still fighting certain battles in the world, in our society, and the world of sports. But I think the notion that athletes are also citizens who have other desires and aspirations aside from helping their team win or excel in sports has been a productive thing. I think that the notion that athletes should just shut up and play is really it's a myth in a lot of ways, and it really views athletes as people who just supply entertainment for the American public, right? Sports at its best, if we think sport is a democratic, it embodies our democratic ideals, then it really has to do that. It has to do that in substance and not just in our dominant discourse. And I think when you look at the history of sport, we've seen this all the way through, right? I'm looking at a moment similar to ours in this book where politics have really polarized. Society is changing rapidly. You've got people who are supportive and encouraging of those changes, and you have other people who are not and are fighting it, tooth and nail. And what makes sports in Texas interesting in that period is that it was on the side of change. And I think that that's a moment we need to revisit now as we think about how sport can help us imagine a society that's more equitable now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. Like, you talked about football and some of the like big popular sports, but you also talked about like the huge changes that happened in tennis
Yes.
here in Houston, which I mean, I always knew about the Billie Jean King Bobby Riggs match, but I don't think I realized that that match was played in Houston and that Houston had kind of been the epicenter of the women's tennis movement, kind of pushing for, more than what they had, more than what they were being paid, and moving out of the shadow of male tennis. And I think it's really interesting that it happens here a lot and then it pushes out through the country.
Yeah.
So do we think that that's it more about economics, that suddenly we realize it's much more economical to integrate, to push for more women's sport, and then other people go, oh, we could be making this money? Or do we think that at this time it was something else?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Anytime you're looking at a moment of historical change, substantial change like we saw in that period, you have to account for the role of the economy. Absolutely. And part of the reason why Texas is sort of a ground zero place for these changes in the broader South, right? Of course, in the rest of the country, in the North and the West and Midwest, there was much more racial integration than we saw in the South, right? That's true. So why is it that Texas becomes the epicenter of this transformation in the South, before in Alabama, before Georgia, before New Orleans, or other cities that wind up becoming professional sports cities? It is because the oil economy is in this upward trajectory throughout the entirety of the 20th century until the 1980s when the economy busts, right? So this is a moment of extraordinary economic growth. This is particularly in the energy industry and other industries as well, banking, financing, and much of that money is flowing into the sports world. Absolutely. You can understand the founding of the American Football League by Lamar Hunt and K.S. Bud Adams, Texas sports entrepreneurs, without understanding that they were sons of oilmen, right? It's not by accident that many of these professional owners were deeply intertwined in the oil economy, including Jerry Jones, the current owner of the Dallas Cowboys, right? So that's part of the story. And it is absolutely true that the Hunts and the Adams, who were sons of segregationists, made a calculation. They were like, we want sports to be part of our society. And we know if we're going to do that, we're going to have to let go of legalized segregation. We're going to have to join the rest of the country. And they did, right? And they did it because it was profitable, but they also were informed by a civic mission. They really were determined to put Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Austin and other cities on the map through sports, just like other public officials did. So, that's definitely part of the equation. But there is a significant shift in terms of how Texans are thinking about sport and society at that time. And, I mentioned Jerry Levias, and the great example, it was his head coach, Hayden Fry, who was from West Texas, right? I think he was from Odessa, who, was raised as a white person, quote unquote, in Jim Crow segregated West Texas. And he had told himself that he didn't understand the logic of racial segregation. And he said to himself that, well, if I ever got into a position of authority, in which if I become a coach, I'm going to sign black players. And when he's offered the job by Southern Methodist in 1961, he says, I will do it if you allow me to integrate my athletic roster, right? So he does that because he wants to win, but he does that because he has a moral compass. He has an ethical compass, and he understood the illogic of racial segregation, right? And I think a lot of coaches in that era were making similar calculations that were certainly based on their desire to win games, absolutely, to be competitive, to take down the Texases and the Arkansas, the big dogs of the old Southwest Conference. But I also think that, they're also getting messages from the civil rights movement that there's a new day, right? And, some coaches, resisted it a little longer, including Darrell Royal. But others, like those like Hayden Fry and Bill Yeoman at the University of Houston, and other coaches, Guy Lewis at the University of Houston, the legendary basketball coach, didn't. And so they departed. They made decisions. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's very easy to look back and say, wow, of course, this was going to happen inevitably because the economy was booming and the country was changing. I want us to think about the historical actors who decide to stand outside of history, and I really think that we see that a lot in the stories that I uncovered in this book.
Well, and I think it's interesting too that when we look at the college football programs in the state that are popular and big time. So we have the two big ones, A&M and UT, that were not didn't have any interest really in integrating at the time.
Mhm.
And then you kind of have the smaller upstart, they compete in the same league. They, they don't always get the best players because they're not UT and A&M. And so there's also this thought process of what can we do to beat those teams, and this plays into it too, right?
Oh, yeah.
We last month we had Dr. Hurd, and he talked about his book about all the black football players that we don't know about, and it's really interesting how we, as a state that feels like football is our identity, that we lost so many amazing players from high school into college during this time period to schools outside of the South because they didn't want to sign them. And so I do think it's interesting that you've got Houston and SMU making the decision to sign these players and keep the talent here. And then they are able to pull out, in some cases, amazing victories over the schools that had chosen not to go that way.
Well, that's exactly right, and you have to also include Texas Western today. UTEP, right? Texas Western wins the national championship in 1966 with an all-black starting five against the Kentucky Wildcats. I don't talk about Texas Western explicitly in the book because I had to make certain decisions about which stories I could tell. The book is thick enough, as you can see.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, there's no question that is those schools who have aspirations, athletic aspirations. But even Bill Yeoman is another one. Bill Yeoman, the head football coach at the University of Houston, he was part of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And, when they would ask him, why did you sign Warren McVay, the first black scholarship athlete with the University of Houston football program? He said, "Oh, it had nothing." I mean, he might have been being only partially truthful, but he says, "Look, I do right by what the Lord wants me to do. I take those ideas seriously. I do, because that's what the historical actors say. But it is absolutely certain that the University of Houston, which was not in the Southwest Conference, but joins it when they start beating the big dogs, when they tie the Texas Longhorns at Memorial Stadium in 1968." And they signal to the Longhorns that, hey, there's a new game in town, and these guys, this is a program that's up and coming. And it's not by accident that actually the UT kind of falls behind, these other programs. Once Earl Campbell is gone by 1977, 78, Longhorns kind of really paid the price for not integrating fast enough, right? And that was sort of on Darrell Royal and the administration at the time. So, yeah, no, those are the forces that drive social change. It's this combination of intellectual awakening. I think we're seeing that now in our society, but it's certainly facilitated by economic forces and the social movements of the time. Yes.
And you kind of briefly touched on it at the end because it is outside of the time frame that you really talked about, but as we were kind of talking about SMU becoming the bigger and bigger powerhouse, of course, you can't really talk about that without talking about the death penalty and all the things that happened to them. And I have to admit, I have probably seen that 30 for 30 2-part special about SMU more than one time.
Yeah,
so I think it's just really interesting kind of how, and I think in some ways this is kind of a trend too, right? So we make big changes and we make decisions that have huge cultural changes, and then those changes kind of get away from each individual kind of sport, and then kind of the Texas sports kind of, there's this kind of falling out of the bottom, and then one might say rebuilding again to see what the new changes are that we're gonna make.
That's exactly right. You're articulating kind of a sense of change, how change over time works, right? And I say in the book that the 1980s, which dovetails with the kind of collapse of the oil economy in the state, which had devastating consequences on a lot of people, really had an impact on the sports world. So that Clint Murchison Jr. of the Murchison dynasty, he loses his wealth. He dies in 1987. He was the owner of the Dallas Cowboys for 25 years. Those luxury suites that the affluent classes would party in at Texas Stadium were empty by the mid 1980s. You're seeing a lot of these sports teams, with the exception of women's programs, actually, really kind of petering out in terms of their success on the field and the revenue that they generate. And I think what you also see are the consequences of social change that is driven by economic forces, right? So what we see over time, and we certainly see today, is that once the profitability of college athletics, if we just use that as the example here, becomes really clear by the 1980s, once it's clear that Jackie Sherrill in 1982 can sign a contract with the Texas A&M Aggies for a then unprecedented $1.6 million, which blows the roof off of salaries for head coaches, and you see coaching staffs grow and grow and grow and grow till we have today, what you have is a situation where the sport management class, predominantly white, has figured out how to extract value from athletic labor, and so that has consequences, right? It minimized the social impact of sports. So that racial integration was not novel by the 1980s, right? The struggles take a different form as time goes on. And I think, unfortunately, what we have seen is that, since so much of this was predicated on commercialized sport, whether we're talking about professional sport or, in this case, collegiate sport, because, notwithstanding what the NCAA says, big time college athletics is a business. And the story of the death penalty, in some ways, I have a slightly different read on it. In my view, these were athletic laborers. And ironically, the SMU boosters were at least trying to, funnel some money to the players, and
Yep.
the NCAA didn't want that to happen.
Right. I think the
And
quote is
programs
they
like
were
Texas didn't want that to happen either, right? So
right,
there's a kind of politics between the
right,
institutions of the Southwest
right.
Conference at the
I
time.
think the quote that I think is really interesting in that um, series is they had a payroll to make.
Payroll to Meet, which is
Yep.
the title of that great book about it. It's based on the book by, I'm forgetting the author's name. Yeah, it's an excellent book, and I leaned on it very heavily. Yeah, and it's not by accident that many of these programs are under probation in the mid 1980s, and SMU pays the biggest price, but so does the University of Houston. These programs that actually catapulted the
Right.
SWC into the future, in some ways, pay the price, and they're frozen out of the Big 12 when that conference is formed years later. Yeah.
Yeah. And like for SMU, really only the last
Yeah.
2, maybe 3 years have they even managed to come back and have a competitive
That's right.
a competitive team. Um, and then I think that's why they made different decisions when Penn happened. Not to say that that was right or wrong, but it's interesting too how we kind of learn from the thought process of what we did before. And of course, as we're talking about this today, there were arguments before the Supreme Court today
That's right.
about college sport and amateurism, and some pretty interesting questions from some of the justices
Yes.
to the lawyers for the NCAA. So
Yep.
I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens, and with that, and then how that changes, because it is very hard to justify paying the coaching staffs millions of dollars, and sometimes to the detriment of other programs on
Absolutely.
campus, right? Academic programs, other sports programs. Um, and I think it's an interesting question to have about at what point you say this is enough.
Yeah, and and that you mentioned the tennis story, and it's a different context, completely different. But what we see happening in the tennis world in the late '60s is the overthrow of amateurism, right? Tennis was not a professionalized sport. It was here and there, but in general, the dominant tennis world was committed to amateurism. The idea that you just play for the love of the sport, and most tennis players are from the affluent classes, and so this wasn't a problem. Although many of the best players got money under the table, just like the way college athletes have been getting for generations, right? And so what we see happening there are, really pioneered not just by the men's players, but certainly the women's tennis tour was all about pay equity. It was about, well, if we're going to professionalize and we're going to be able to make a living, well, women should be able to do the same thing as men players. And they made an economic argument, because the prevailing notion at the time, by sexist, male tennis establishment was that nobody cares about the women's game, and they were wrong, right? They established their market value by getting a sponsorship from Phyllis Morris Tobacco Money, the Virginia Slim's cigarette brand in 1970, right? And that convergence happens actually in Houston. And one of the leaders of that movement, of the original 9, was Nancy Ritchie, a Texan tennis star from San Angelo, who was one of the 9 players who broke away from the USTA to take a stand for pay equity. And they ushered in this industry, which is this $1 trillion industry today, and that the women's game is as popular and more popular than the men's game now, right? So amateurism was overthrown in the tennis world, but it hasn't been overthrown yet in big time collegiate athletics. And I'm not a fortune teller, but it's hard for me to see this situation continuing as it is.
Yeah, I mean, it, especially now that we know more about the toll
Yep.
that some of these things take on these players' bodies, on their
That's right.
minds, eventually, in some cases, with CTE and other things like that. It's really hard to justify why we think they shouldn't be getting something, especially based on how much money the universities
Yeah. Yeah.
make from that.
Yeah.
And we're certainly the state of 75,000 seat high school
Yeah.
football stadiums. So, I think it's an interesting discussion kind of all around, more not just when you're talking about the college level. Obviously, we're not paying high schools, but
Yes.
we are doing without for other things
Yes.
to pay for 75,000 seat stadiums
With
in.
jumbotrons and the jumbotrons. I remember. I don't know if you watched the Friday Night Lights TV show, which I adored, and it actually really figured in my thinking and my decision to write this book because I lived in Austin. I taught at the University of Texas Austin. In that period when they were filming the show in Austin, and there's that great moment where the Buddy Garrity character, who's a former alum of the Permian Panthers or whatever the school was called, and he pushes as a booster the building of a big jumbotron stadium. And the principal, tough Tammy Taylor, says, "You know what? No, we're not going to do that. I'm going to take that money and I'm going to put it towards academics." Right. So, that's a moment I always remember from that TV show. It's probably wish fulfillment. You wish that sort of thing would happen more
Don't you? Yeah. Well,
often.
and it's interesting because I'm actually originally from the Panhandle.
Uh-huh.
So I grew up, our district, we played Permian, and I'm actually of the age that the year that the book
Yes.
is written,
Yes.
I was a junior in high school. So, and Amarillo High was the team where I went to high school. We were one of the three teams that they had to do the coin
Coin flip.
flip
Yes.
for. And yes. And so, yeah, and it was always very interesting when we played them because they were far enough away that if we had played them, we didn't go. Like the band didn't come, boosters didn't go, right? I mean, it's a long drive between Odessa and Amarillo. But when they played in Amarillo, there would be hundreds of them. And they would bring their band, and it was crazy.
I can only imagine. I wish I
But
had an opportunity to actually experience that in person, or maybe not, but I wish I could have.
but the year after I graduated from high school is when they got into all the trouble.
That's right.
And then they weren't allowed to play in playoff games that, and those things as well. And one might argue that they've never been as successful as they were in the 80s.
At that time. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, one of the unfortunate omissions from the book is I don't talk a lot about high school sports, because I was committed to different sports stories. So this could have been, look, most of our conversation is about football. It could have been yet another book about Texas football. And that would have been easy, but I really wanted to highlight these dynamics in other sports, tennis, basketball, and baseball. I had visions of a soccer chapter, but it didn't come together. So, but naturally, football takes center stage in the story because of its outsized impact on Texas society. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that, that story, really does show the limits of the integration era. I mean, he takes you through the sordid details of how that process happens in West Texas. And what I liked about the TV show, even though it was fictional, is that you had a, and I tried to implement this in this book, you had a wider vision of all the people who are entangled in football culture. Right. The cheerleaders, right, actually have significant play in the TV show, just like cheerleaders have in my book. Right. The grandmother with Alzheimer's, right. The women actors get much more attention in the TV show than, Bissinger's book. Right. So you can understand why people are fanatical about football, why these athletes give so much of their bodies, to the sport, what the teachers experience. Bissinger's book is a classic, of course, but what this book tried to do was emulate a bit, a history of sport in Texas that widens the frame a bit. So you're looking at different actors, different sports. Yeah.
Right. And like I did appreciate that, like you included the discussion of cheerleader culture and that, and not just kind of the Dallas Cowboys cheerleader culture. And we know that there have been a lot of lawsuits in the last few years about how ridiculous they don't pay them, which is just craziness. But there was a big Netflix series about the cheerleading program in Corsicana that was really big during the pandemic.
Yes.
And I think it's an interesting conversation about how we think of cheerleading as kind of the cutesy girly sport, and not even a sport. But it really is a sport. And there's all of these things that go into that. And I would argue you can't think about the Dallas Cowboys and not think about the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders. And it does seem criminal that at least at one point, originally it was like $15 a game. And I
$15 every
think,
home game.
yeah. And I think that because they have settled a lawsuit, it's all hush hush. You don't know what's happened. But before that, I actually had a friend who worked for that organization in like back office, but they were paying them $50 a game.
Yeah. No. And their popularity really enhanced the Cowboy brand. That's undeniable, right? I really, one of the first chapters I envisioned was a chapter on the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. Obviously, this is a bigger story beyond them, right? And I start the story by looking at drill teams in the Jim Crow era, and I focus on the Kilgore Rangerettes, this iconic drill team that achieves national popularity for their performances on Thanksgiving, and in particular the Cotton Bowl annual classic on January 1st. Right? Because I want the reader to appreciate things that cheerleaders know and dancers know, is that's hard work, right? And it's hard work, not just physically, but emotionally, right? I mean, the ways in which Nell Davis, the leader of the Kilgore Rangerettes, insisted that you do all this hard stuff with a smile on your face, right? As she said famously or infamously, she said, beauty knows no pain, when in fact, doing what Rangerette had to do involved a lot of pain, squeezing those belts really tight, doing these 2-a-days that are analogous to what football players would have experienced in the hot August sun when they're trying out for these teams. And you see that dynamic, when cheerleaders become professionalized with the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders in 1972, when they are formed, that iteration of them. And so, yes, I want us to appreciate the importance of cheerleading culture, the sidelines in our understanding of sports culture. I want us to understand that in the pre-Title IX era, 1972, cheerleading was one of those spaces that, athletically inclined, presumed attractive women would be a part of. And then once women's sports develops after the 1970s, you're seeing a shift in that pattern, but you still see that too. So that today cheerleading is a more robust industry than professional NFL cheerleaders. And that's what the great and Netflix documentary shows, the kind of competitive cheerleading scene from Navarro College. And that's a that's a brutal labor regime too, right? So yeah, I think sexism drives so much of how we deride women's labor. And it's easy to do that with the cheerleaders. But my story is trying to demonstrate how important that work was, how important the labor was, how it helped enhance the Cowboy brand, how it helped make the Cowboys money, and how undercompensated those women were, and they still are. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, they still send them out to do USO tours and all. I mean, it is the face of the team.
Yes.
Whether they want to admit that or not. In
Absolutely.
A lot of ways, it is the face of the team. And I also thought it was really interesting. You talked about. So I'm not as big of a baseball or a basketball fan, I have to admit, but I do like. I kind of knew some of the basketball history because I have a family member who was such a huge San Antonio fan that it was my grandmother that she was actually buried in her jersey.
Wow. There you go. That's amazing.
But I think, and I also remember the big controversy which you mentioned about the young boy singing the national anthem in his amazing outfit. But I think it's interesting that you talk about why the cultures around each team is so different, because they've kind of grown up in that area very differently. And San Antonio's culture and the way they deal with the Spurs is very different from the Mavericks and the Rockets.
No doubt. Yeah. And that was the other thing I wanted to do in this book, is I wanted a discussion of San Antonio and the Spurs, because they're often overlooked. It's interesting. They're one of the most successful NBA franchises, and yet they don't really receive a whole lot of attention, and because they're seen as from sleepy San Antonio, that's, a very Mexican-American town. And yet the Spurs, where the story goes is that they were borrowed from the owners of the Dallas Chaparrals, ABA franchise, because they were failing miserably in Dallas. And, these investors led by Angelo Drossos, decided to take a risk and borrow the franchise and see if it would work in San Antonio. And it did. and the Spurs caught on like wildfire in the early 70s, starting in 1973. And they were part of the ABA league, which was a fledgling operation, which was trying to challenge the National Basketball Association's domination of professional basketball. And so they did what a smart entrepreneur does. They figure out a way to connect with fans, and they figured out that predominantly, Mexican American town, needed to be at the Hemisphere Arena, watching the Spurs play. And they were. And so one of the things that makes Spurs culture distinct, obviously, Spurs fans come from all sorts of backgrounds, not just Mexican, but the undeniable presence of Mexican American culture in the arena to this day, right? And I know this firsthand because I'm married to a San Antonio who's Mexican American, so I've seen, experienced firsthand Spurs fandom, and that is an example of what we do see in this period in other teams too. Is this kind of grassroots marketing. These are not schemes and promotions that are developed by Madison Avenue people like with the Los Spurs franchise campaign or something like that. This is really an interesting relationship between a franchise and a city, that needed each other in a lot of ways. And I think that that really accounts for what we see happening in 2013 when Sebastián de la Cruz sings the national anthem in his mariachi garb. For Spurs fans, that's normal. For the rest of the country, it's like, well, what is this, right? And for racists, it's like, well, what is this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and even at the time, Dallas sports writers would really poo-poo and deride Spurs fans. They were kind of bitter that they lost their franchise until the Mavericks were founded in 1980. So I really wanted Sleepy San Antonio to be part of the story. And I want us to imagine Texas as a place that has very vibrant Latino, Latinx sporting cultures and fan cultures. The fans that we often think about are the ones that we imagine Cowboy fans or fans of the Texans or the Longhorns. But, San Antonio does have a very unique, just like Houston too, I think, and Dallas, very unique fan cultures. And I wanted that to be part of the story too. Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting about Sebastian is that after all of that controversy, that the Spurs organization said, okay,
Yep.
we're just going to have him sing the national anthem at every single one of these majorly televised games. And I think that also kind of goes to show the culture that they have with their fan base and the people who live in their city.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And, obviously it's a working class city. So, Spurs tickets are not as expensive. I mean, they're not cheap, but they're not as expensive as going to see the Mavericks, I would imagine. The economic, basis of the wealth is not the same. But again, even in today's arena, you see the imprint of that culture. You do. And I think it's what makes the Spurs franchise really unique. I do.
Well, and so the reason why my grandmother was such a fan is that she was a school teacher and she taught in a Catholic, mostly Hispanic school, in a relatively poor neighborhood in San Antonio. And she reached out to them one time to say, hey, we'd like to see what we need to do to bring students. How much would that cost the school? What do you need to do? What do we need to do? And they took, I don't know how many, a significant portion of the student body, sent them to the games free of charge.
Interesting.
And can continue to do that for years. And she was kind of their liaison between the school, even after she retired, between the school and the Spurs. And they continued that kind of outreach in the schools. And it was certainly an experience that many of those children wouldn't have gotten any other way. And so I do think it's interesting that it's an interesting discussion about how integral some of these organizations are in our communities that we maybe we don't see or we don't realize.
Yeah. And the story of this book, I'm glad you're raising this in this particular way. It's great to hear that story, is that what we see happening in that period is an interesting alliance between sports management, owners, coaches, and athletes from marginalized backgrounds. And in order for a sport culture to be dynamic and inclusive and everything we want, you need to have both of those dynamics at work. And you need to have management who understands that if you're a professional sports franchise, obviously profit matters as an investment, but you need to see yourself as a custodian of an institution. And all of these franchises now have deep roots in Texas. And so, unfortunately, I think what we often see from management is that they're just concerned about the bottom line, and that's it. But, sport at its best, when it has worked. And you see this also with the Houston Astrodome, which is the first indoor stadium in the United States, which, was known for, pioneering the usage of the luxury suite, which is now a feature of every stadium in the country since then. But Roy Hoffines, the genius behind the Astrodome, understood that he needed the working class fan, right? So and the Astrodome becomes beloved by Houstonians because it catered to a wide demographic, and that's what sport. When we think of sport as a civic institution and not just a business,
Right.
and I think that these places have civic responsibilities, and I think the best franchises demonstrate that. And I would argue the Spurs is one of them. Yeah, I would.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because here in the DFW Metroplex, I don't think a lot of people know that both the Mavericks and the Rangers are very involved in literacy programs.
Is that
So
right? Interesting.
yeah, so for many years, the Rangers would do free kids tickets as part of summer reading giveaways for libraries in the area, and the Mavericks actually in January, February-ish, they run a reading challenge that they work with local libraries, and they actually provide all the promotions and the giveaways and all of that as part of their outreach. And so I think it's really interesting that it's one of the things about sports that we really don't talk about. But I do think, like, I don't know any football teams that do that.
They should.
Yes, we should. But I think it's interesting that it is the sports that cater more towards a working class group than that also then think about what are we doing in the community, what are we giving back, that sort of thing. Yeah,
no, you're exactly right. And I think we're in a moment now, because of equity and inclusion are more uppermost in our minds now, is that we are seeing some franchises do more than just standard philanthropy. I think that's what they've tended to do, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But I do think what we've seen over the last year, or even if it's just with the statements of solidarity, against racism or whatever, I mean, that's just cosmetic. But you are seeing more substantial shifts, and questions about who are running these franchises, questions of equity and management. Major League Baseball just finally signed their first woman GM this past year, the Miami Marlins, right? Karen Ng. There's attention to the dynamics of sexual harassment. All of these things that have kept out marginalized people from sports management are now being highlighted. And that's really to the benefit of the institution, because the more people who can participate, the better that these institutions will be, as far as I'm concerned, and that's my hope for the future of sport, is that, in the period that I looked at in this book, the inclusion happens at the level of the player, right? Black athletes are joining teams, predominantly white teams, or exclusively white teams. Women athletes are finally showing up on the big stage as a result of Title IX and feminism. But all of that stay at the level of players, right? Very few ascend to the level of management. And that's the next frontier of inclusion in the sports world and change, I think. And I think that's what we're seeing now, even if you look at what's happening with the WNBA, right? I mean, you're seeing a lot of interesting developments on that front too. And I think that, some owners are going to resist, but others will be farsighted, like the men that I talked about in this book, and will accommodate those changes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think you have seen more Black coaches in, say, basketball, because I can think of like Elgin Baylor, and some others, but I think we're finally getting to that point where we're thinking about, we've had a girl kicker in a college football game this year. We have some female football refs now, and don't we have a woman coaching basketball team?
I believe so. Like, I don't know if it might be a head coach of one of the D leagues teams, if I remember right. But you have now women assistants. Or again, the Spurs is a great example.
Right.
Yeah. So you're seeing some incremental change that needs to accelerate a little more. And I think what we're seeing too is the explosion of so many of the myths that have guided our thinking about women in sports, which is that it's not profitable, doesn't have an interest, doesn't command a market. And and the more research we do on these questions, the more we see that, well, that some of that is just myths. And I think that's been a welcome development. I do, because it's important for marginalized people to see people in leadership positions. It really is, and it has an effect on on the society as a whole. I think that's the point I'm making in this book. That sport, and on one hand, is removed from society. It's entertainment. It reflects our aspirations, but it can catalyze change too, because of something I also talk about, the impact of television. You cannot understand the so-called sports revolution of the 60s and 70s without understanding the impact, the profound impact of television. That's how I learned about Texas sports. How did I know anything about Texas when I was growing up in New York City in the late 70s, early 80s? By watching the Dallas Cowboys on Monday Night Football, by watching the Texas Longhorns and Earl Campbell on Saturday afternoons on
Right.
CBS Sports, by listening to Don Meredith on Monday Night Football, Phyllis George, who I talk about in this book too, right? So, the media played a huge role in popularizing this emerging new Texas that we see in the 60s and 70s. And that's why sport continues to be impactful, because it's such very much part of our media landscape too. Yeah.
And we are such a large state that the variety, right? We I think we probably support a lot more professional teams in in sports that are not super well known, right?
That's
I
right.
mean, we
That's right.
also have a lot of, we have soccer teams, and we have, racing is obviously really big, and it's a large enough area and a diverse enough group of people that um, we're making an effect on more than just the stuff you see, the big stuff you see on television all the time.
Yeah, and I saw that firsthand when I lived and taught. I lived in Austin, and I taught at the University of Texas for 11 years. And this book originated in that period, because my understanding of Texas society and sports, moved from seeing it on television to experience it day to day in San Antonio and Austin mostly, but in other parts of the state too. And on the one hand, I encountered the standard stereotypes of Texas fans being serious about who the second string offensive lineman is for the Longhorns and that sort of thing. But I saw something more impactful and interesting. I did see these kind of community gatherings around sport that, as dirty as the business seems, they're significant. Whether it's Spurs, whether it was the Spurs championship run, or even when the Longhorns made their national championship run with Vince Young was their star quarterback. It was a very interesting time in Austin. To see the city galvanize around that team. Among people who are not even alums. It really made an impact on me, and it got me to think about, okay, what's the history behind this thing that we associate with Texas fanaticism around sports? And that's really what inspired me to write the book.
Well, I because I'm from the rural part of the state.
Yeah.
I grew up listening to sports on the radio.
Yeah.
Which I think, well, at least from some interactions from people I know from other states, this is a weird thing. It's a weird thing that they broadcast high school basketball games on the radio and that people listen to them.
Yeah.
And so my ex-husband was originally from California, and we came out here one year for Christmas and visited family kind of all over the state. And of course, when you're driving in the middle of nowhere in West Texas, you listen to AM radio. Yes. And you listen to whatever station you can get. And 95% of the time it is sports. Yes, of course. And yeah. It's high school basketball, and it's girls volleyball, and it's, I think we actually listened to the Cowboys game on the radio, driving from like Dallas to Amarillo. And he was like, this is the weirdest thing I have ever, this is weird. And like, I even admit now that I sometimes, because you can get radio over, the internet now. Yes, yes. I sometimes listen to high school football games from home, especially when things are, they're playing well or whatever. I'll just put it on and listen to that. So I know that in a lot of ways, we kind of have accepted a sports culture that's very different from a lot of other states' sports cultures.
Certainly different than my home state here in New York City. New York State, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we have sports fanaticism, but it doesn't reach down to the high school level. This is the biggest city in the country, right? But yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's, you could look at that as like, well, that's strange and pathological. But again, one of the things I try, there's a lot of play-by-play in my book, because I'm trying, I think the sports fan will appreciate that, sports is compelling. What I love about sports? Compelling, virtuosic, athletic performance, so that even if I'm not a fan of a certain team, I love to see people push themselves and come together the way I described or that opening of chapter 3. It makes for compelling theater, and I think that that's important. Like scholars like me tend to dismiss that as, well, that's not that important. But I think for the historian, we really do need to reckon with the power of what happens on the field or on the court or on the pitch, because that's why people listen. That's why folk in your people were listening to high school games and Cowboy games, and that's why we watch on TV. And sometimes we try to play it. Those of us who try, who are not as good at it. I'm not. And I think that's part of the story, and that's what I appreciated about Friday Night Lights, the TV show, and the book to a lesser extent, because I think it allowed you to understand the dynamics that work when people go to those games on Friday night. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say that a football game is very different when you listen to it on the radio.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah.
Right? Because it is very much about the play-by-play.
Yes.
And the paying attention to what's really happening, and so many things that you don't actually see. It's not discussed when you're watching it on television, because you can actually see what's happening. Whereas when you're listening to it on the radio, they really do have to paint a picture for you of what's happening and how,
Absolutely.
And it's so much more dramatic.
It is. No, and that's the same thing with baseball. Baseball's a great radio sport. You're not into baseball, but I'll vouch for that. And then again, in that period, you've got Vern Lundquist is, doing the radio, Cowboys radio in the late 70s, early 80s. Brad Sham, the long time, you got some really great broadcasters to help paint the picture too. And that's definitely part of the story of my book. The role of Texas media, sports media, is really impactful, and it's not by accident that so many of these people ascend to the national stage.
Yes.
Who come out again, Phyllis George is another example, the so-called pageant woman, who gets her job because she's attractive, but and she had to contend with a lot of nonsense and sexism trying to make it in the NFL today in the 70s and 80s. And and even though she really wasn't a whole lot of space by the television director, but again, it's not by accident they picked Texans, because Texans come from a robust athletic culture where everybody or a lot of people understand how it works.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so we're almost out of time.
Yeah, an hour already. Wow.
I know we have some call-in listeners, so they're probably not going to be able to post questions. So I'm going to ask you one last question,
Sure.
And then we'll wrap it up for the evening. I'd like you to talk about your research process a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I personally love all the images, the photographs that are in the book, but obviously this is a huge topic, and so how you kind of researched and gathered, I think, is very interesting.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So when I agreed to do this book, my thinking at the time in 2013 was, I live in Austin. This will be easy for research because, I'm going to, my first book was on Cuban history. I had to go to Cuba and do all these trips to Cuba and, do research in Cuba was very challenging. So I thought this would be an easy book because all my sources will be, within a drive or a short flight from Austin. And then I left Texas and took a job at Columbia in New York for a variety of reasons. It was hard to leave Texas, actually. And so then I had to kind of really change my plan. So I did a lot of traditional archival research, right? I went to repositories in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, other towns as well, mostly the big cities. And I looked at old newspapers, and I looked at, the architectural, the firm that built and designed the Astrodome. The papers were at the University of Texas, Austin. So I started with that. It actually started with the kind of Astrodome project, and that's why you have the silhouette of the roof on the cover. Astrodome is kind of a significant part of the book. But what made this book happen for me was the internet, right? Was the enormous plethora of sports highlight films and telecasts that are on YouTube and you can access like that. And that was had a major impact on me writing this book, because I could reconstruct certain sporting events by watching them on YouTube, right? I could account for the role of television, of the directors, of the broadcasters, right? There were plenty of radio broadcasts. So David Clyde, Texas Rangers fans know this story very well. The phenom from Houston who who the owner Bob Short pushes out there in 1973 because he's looking to make money for his fledgling Texas Ranger franchise. The entire, it's this monumental event in Texas at the time. The entire radio broadcast is on YouTube. So I don't have to look at game accounts written by sports writers. I could access so many of these things on YouTube. And I could look at a random regular season game between the Texas Rangers and the New York Yankees in 1979 because some sports enthusiast posted on the internet. So that has completely changed my career as a historian. And it really brings to life, allow me to bring to life much of the stuff that you really have to usually rely on, accounts from sports writers. And I still rely on those accounts, but really it is this enormous archive that's out there now that YouTube and other websites provide that made this book happen. And so that I could kind of balance the kind of on-site archival research with this other stuff that I was finding on the internet. And because there's a lot of Texas sports fans, there's old Southwest Conference highlight films, sponsored by Humble Oil from 1974, like things like that are on YouTube. So that was an absolute blast. Writing books for me are really hard. It's actually not that fun sometimes for me, but I love the research. And, it allowed me to relive things that I remember or correct certain memories or misrememberings that I had. And so that was a big part of this book. And it remains that in my subsequent work on sport. I mean, I rely on this all the time. There isn't a day that goes by where I don't see what's being posted on YouTube now.
Well, and I'm sure it made the play-by-plays much easier
Absolutely.
to write because you're not
Absolutely.
having to depend on what somebody else wrote.
That's
You can
exactly
actually
right.
watch that and then write it for yourself.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And, it's funny that people that you say, all these posts on YouTube. We have stations here that play old games.
That's great. See, somebody like me would be really into that.
Like it's a pretty deep cable station, but there's a deep cable station that you can turn it on and you might get a college football game from the 80s. You might get some baseball games. So I think it's interesting that it shows that there's a market for that, right? You know what happened.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
People are still rewatching those games.
Oh, that's irrelevant. I mean, that's part of the fun is reliving it or miss, watching something you missed maybe, when you were younger. Like SMU Digital Library has this great archive that they post every day of WFAA Channel 8 news telecasts. So I use that too. So I could see, clips of Vern Lundquist when he was working for the station, interviewing Ed Too Tall Jones in 1979, or, recreate some of those Texas Ranger moments, which are often hard to recreate because Major League Baseball doesn't have the same archive. Football has much more available on the internet. It's a real, for sport geeks like me, historians, it's a real delight.
Well, I have enjoyed our conversation today, and thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. For those of you who are listening, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, there are copies available at our one of our local independents, the Dock, and you can call them. You can go to the store. You can order it online. And then we have a bunch of great author visits coming up all through the summer. Check out our website, fortworthlibrary.org. Click on the calendar and you can find all kinds of great topics and interesting authors that are coming to visit. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, and everybody have a great evening.